Lesson 15, what is a good exposure? The idea that a photograph can be correctly exposed, I think, is inadequate. I don't believe there's a correct or an incorrect way to expose a photograph, unless it's one that's purposed for very technical reasons. There is no right or wrong in art, and photography shouldn't be judged purely by technical standards because it's such a creative process. It's important to understand that a good exposure is one that you're happy with because the photo looks the way that you want it to. Sure, there'll be times where a photo is too bright or too dark. These are overexposed and underexposed photos, but at times there'll be such a contrast range that you won't be able to expose the brightest and the darkest parts of an image well. So you've got choices to make. Some technical purists will teach you that a good photograph contains a tone range from the very brightest to the very darkest, where you can still see detail. I don't teach this because I don't believe that you have to take good photos based on some technical ideal. It's possible to take great photos that are purely black and white with no tonal range in between. What is most important is that you set your exposure intentionally to get the photo looking the way you want it to. Sometimes you might underexpose your subject. This often happens if your camera is set to an auto mode and you've got a very bright background. In the extremes, you'll create a silhouette. In high contrast situations, particularly when the light's very bright, your camera will not be able to record the detail in both the brightest and the darkest parts of an image evenly. You'll have to make a choice about which part of the image is most important and that you want exposed well. Sometimes you'll want the details in the shadow areas. At other times, you want to see details in the highlights, and therefore you'll need to expose for the highlights or for the shadows. When using your phone to take photos, this may not be so noticeable because the phone uses computation to balance the brightest and darkest areas of the photos that you take before you get to see them. Being able to work with and manage photos with a limited tone range, where not everything is going to be evenly exposed, is part of the creativity of photography. This was always much more critical with film photography because the tone range of film is much narrower than what it is with modern digital sensors and new cameras. Being able to paint with light requires you to understand the tone range that you see and what your camera can capture of that tone range. And this has to do with the dynamic range of your camera's sensor. This is how much tone the camera can capture in one single image between the darkest and the brightest points and still retain detail. If the tone range is very broad, you will not be able to create images that contain detail in both the brightest and the darkest areas. As you've learned, with your camera set to any of the auto or semi-auto modes, it's in control of the exposure. How you use your exposure meter helps you choose which areas of your compositions are used to help calculate your exposure. Using manual mode makes it easier to control your exposures in this way. Using live view or your electronic viewfinder helps you see the adjustments as you make them and shows you how your photo is going to look. It's usually most important to have your main subject well exposed, but sometimes you'll want to manage your exposure settings so that maybe your subject is very dark or quite bright, as this will create a specific mood that you may want. But for now, I want you to concentrate on having your main subject well exposed, not too bright and not too dark. Lesson 15, practical exercise. What is a good exposure? This exercise will help you understand more about the tone range we see with our eyes and what our cameras can capture and how this is different. This exercise will be best on a sunny day outdoors. Choose a light subject and a dark one or a few to photograph and set your camera to aperture priority. Set up your subjects so that you can clearly see some of the shadows in your composition as well. Once you've photographed them together, then separate them. Take some with just the light subject and then just the dark subject. And try and get some of your compositions so they include a good amount of the sky. Once you've done that, reposition yourself and or your subjects so that you can get a dark background. So if you're in the sun, choose a position where you can see a background that's predominantly in the shade so that most of your background will be dark. And then separate your subjects again and photograph just the light one and then just the dark one against the dark background. And then take a few photos of the same sort of compositions using your phone. The main points from this lesson are: there is no right or wrong way to expose a photo. Be intentional about your exposure settings. It's important to learn how to expose your main subject well. Practice this to improve your photography. Look at the tone range as you prepare to take a photo and think about how your exposure settings will affect how it looks in the photos that you'll take.